Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation. My name is Constantinos and I'm a PhD student at ETH Zurich under the supervision of Professor Stojadinovic. In my PhD I'm working on seismic metamaterials implemented on a regional scale, which will eventually drive us to the concept of metacities. So in my today's presentation I'm going to be talking about the use of the domain reduction method, which is a finite element method that we are using to realistically model the seismic wave field to simulate the seismic response of an existing structure protected by those resonating unit cell metamaterials. So what are those metamaterials? Most usually we're talking about natural or artificial materials or even structures that exhibit extraordinary properties like negative stiffness or negative Poisson ratio or negative equivalent mass, which are all properties that cannot be met in natural materials. So by being able to construct such metamaterials with those properties, one can gain total control over the wave propagation. And let me show you here a couple of examples. So here at the left you can see how the incoming waves are scattered away due to the presence of this object here in the middle. However, when we surround this object with the cloak metamaterial, you can see that the incoming waves are able to go around this object and be reshaped again afterwards, and this makes this object here in the middle totally invisible. Another example would be here, where you can see the incoming waves, instead of following a path like this one or maybe this one, if this was a natural material, a negative refraction phenomenon is taking place and the waves are refracted in this direction, as you can see. Coming now to civil engineering scale, the research community has been mainly focusing on resonant metamaterials to control the incoming seismic waves, mitigate their effects on structures, and enhance seismic resilience of communities. So resonant metamaterials are usually multiple unit cells that exploit the vibration of an internal mass. And as you can see down here in this example, those masses can vibrate either horizontally or vertically, and at specific frequencies right after the resonant one, you can see that those masses will be vibrating out of phase with the vibrating soil, and this can create frequency band gaps. This means that the wave propagation can be prevented in this specific range of frequencies. And coming now to this particular example, you can see that the incoming surface Rayleigh waves are interacting with this seismic barrier consisting of those resonant metamaterials, and at specific frequencies right after the resonant one, where those masses will be vibrating out of phase, the incoming waves will be reflected downwards, and in this way the structure here under consideration can be protected. However, most of the studies that have been published in this field are mainly elaborating on the interaction between the resonant metamaterials and the incoming surface Rayleigh waves, and only a few of those studies have considered the other critical seismic wave component, which is the vertically propagating shear waves that excite the structure from below, like this study from Colombia et al. But even in this case, both the structure and the soil and the interaction between them has been modeled elastically, which is good as a first approach of the problem. However, more advanced numerical models will be developed that will be able to simulate the seismic wave field and the inelastic response of the system fairly realistically in order to thoroughly investigate the efficiency of those resonant metamaterials. So, in order to create advanced numerical models, Real-Easy Simulator was employed, which is a finite element software developed by Professor Boris Yeremits at UC Davis in order to realistically model earthquakes, soil structures, and their interaction. And here are some of the reasons why we have chosen this particular software for our analysis. So first of all, it includes the domain reduction method that I mentioned in the beginning, and this will enable us to realistically model the seismic wave field. It also includes appropriate constitutive models to model the nonlinear behavior of soils, structures, and their interaction. Also, it supports probabilistic analysis, which could be a really powerful tool, especially for problems where the uncertainty of the input parameters could be large. And finally, it supports parallel computing, which dramatically reduces the computational time, allowing us in this way to create large 3D finite element models with thousands of elements. And this is the finite element model that we have created in RealEasy. And if you zoom in, you can see that we have this unit cell here consisting of mass inside that vibrates horizontally with some springs and daspots attached. And you should notice here that the resonant period of our resonators is a little bit higher compared to the resonant period of our structure. And we need that in order for those vibrating masses to be out of phase with respect to our single degree of freedom system for excitation periods close to the resonant one of our structure. So let me give you now a short introduction on how the domain reduction method is working. As you can see down here, our model is separated into three different domains. This inner domain with the light gray color, this outer domain consisted of the so-called damping elements, and this orange domain in between consisting of those DRM elements. And on those DRM elements, we apply some equivalent forces that they generate the wave field that eventually propagates inside this inner domain. So in this particular case, we generate some shear waves that propagate vertically, and when they interact with our system here in the middle, some radiated waves are generated that will eventually enter this outer domain. And the purpose of this domain is to dump out those radiated waves coming from the oscillation of our structure. However, you should notice here that at this bottom layer, we have used a very small amount of damping, and we have done this because we want the radiated waves to come all the way down here and then be reflected on this bedrock that we assume to be at this level, and then go back again into our main domain. Notice here, however, that this is not how the domain reduction method should be used in general, since those outer elements should have always high damping to dump out the radiated waves. But in this particular case, let's say we have implemented an ad hoc solution that works for our case, but we don't recommend it for new users to try something like that. And let me now go to some verification aspects of our model. So let's start with the verification of the free field response. As you can see, we have created a free field model, and the target here will be to reproduce this Ricker wave pulse here on the top. As you can see, the results that we get are pretty much close to the Ricker wave pulse, and so we can claim that our model reproduces successfully the free field response. Notice here that there is no difference between those two models. The only difference is that we have used larger scale factors here at the bottom to visualize better the displacements. And you can see that the soil is moving with its first mode. And since we have no buildings here on the top, that means that no waves will be generated and radiated away, and this is why the outer elements here remain totally inactive. So let's continue the verification process and talk a little bit about the damping elements that we are using here at the outer domain of our model, in case that we want to dump out any radiated waves that are coming from the oscillation of our system here in the middle. So here we are monitoring two different points, point A and the top of our single degree of freedom system, and we are looking into two different values of damping ratio for this layer at the bottom. So if we look at the acceleration time history of point A for the high value of damping ratio, you will see that we get exactly the Richter wave pulse. And this is happening because all the radiated waves that are inserting this domain down here are totally absorbed by the high values of damping ratio of those elements. But as I mentioned earlier, what we want here to do is to let the radiated waves come all the way down here and then be reflected on the bedrock and then propagate again into the main domain, as you will see in the next slide. And for this reason, we are going to use this lower value of damping ratio. So in here you can see four different snapshots that clearly show how the radiated waves are generated from the oscillation of our structure here in the middle and eventually traveling laterally, going downwards and upwards. And just because of that, it might be that we need to increase the length of our model in order to let those waves propagate freely laterally. And this is what we're going to show in the next slide. So we are monitoring here the response of our single degree of freedom system, and we are looking into different values of the length of the model to see how affect the accelerations of our system here on the top. So as you can see, the response is stabilized only after a very large value of the length of the model, and this is eventually the model that we're going to use for the rest of our analysis. And now that we have finished with the verification process, let's elaborate a bit on the results. So this figure compares the response of the single degree of freedom system in terms of acceleration with and without the resonant metamaterials. So the dotted line here is for the case where no metamaterials are embedded next to our system, and the two solid lines represent two different cases with respect to the vibration mass inside the unit cells. So what can someone immediately observe in this diagram is that the presence of the metamaterials can hardly affect the response of our system in the first 2 or 3 cycles. That means that the effectiveness of the resonant metamaterials increases with the number of the excitation cycles, as you can see here in this area. So we might not be able to reduce the first peaks here at the beginning, but the overall reduction of the acceleration later on could be really important for the survival of our structure. Another thing that we should notice here is that the increase of the vibrating mass inside the unit cells seems to have a beneficial effect on the total response of our system. And let me now show you the mechanism behind this reduction of accelerations in this area here. So we are monitoring here the response of our single degree of freedom system and compare it to the response of this vibrating mass inside this unit cell metamaterial. And if you recall from the previous slide, we observed a reduction in the accelerations in this area around here. And this is happening because the two systems, the mass and the single degree of freedom system, are vibrating out of phase in this area around here. However, if you recall from the previous slide again, at the very beginning of the excitation, we observed negligible reduction in the acceleration, and this is happening because the two systems are moving totally in phase here at the beginning of the excitation. And to visualize our results, we plot here the horizontal displacement contours with and without the presence of resonant metamaterials for a time instant of 3 seconds. So as you can see here at the left, where the resonant metamaterials are absent, the displacements are visibly much larger compared to this case where the metamaterials are embedded into the soil, providing some kind of protection for our structure here in the middle. Finally, one should notice here that the vibrating masses inside the unit cells are vibrating out of phase with respect to our single degree of freedom system, and this explains the protective mechanism of those resonant metamaterials. And I would like to close my presentation by giving acknowledgement to the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme for providing the funding for this specific project. So thank you very much for your attention.